Okay, well, yeah, thank you for having me. I've spoken now to uh, probably close to maybe five or six of the different SABR chapters, obviously including Pittsburgh, but a number of other ones across the country as well. So it's always a treat to talk to baseball fans of all varieties. And so I think what might make the most sense is just to very briefly, and I'm not going to talk for super long. I'm more than happy to turn it over to questions here in a little bit. And I find that the conversations that my book, triggers usually are interesting ones. And so I want to give everyone a chance to ask whatever they're curious about. But I did take a kind of a circuitous route to write in general, and then this most recent book in particular, which is very different from my first book. So I guess just backing up to provide a little context, I did grow up in the DC area, not too far from where I am here for work. And as you all know, I was born in '76, and so the '80s we didn't have the Nationals weren't here. So I actually grew up an Oriole fan. My first memories of baseball were watching Cal Ripken and Eddie Murray and that era of Orioles and trying to get up to at first Memorial Stadium, and then later on when I got towards high school, Camden Yards when it opened. Um, and then I went to college in New Jersey, went to live in New York City after college, and that's when a few things happened. One of which is I developed a pretty intense fandom of the Mets. Living there in the late '90s, it was the Bobby Valentine era, the first Subway Series. Just an excite, the Yankee dynasty with Jeter, but then the Mets kind of had these scrappy, overachieving, fun teams, and it was just a great time to be in New York and a great time to be a New York baseball fan. I still, to this day, the Orioles, are still kind of my AL team, but since moving to New York and living there, that the Mets kind of became the team that I grew the closest to. I think part of it was just living in a city, near a team that you could get to frequently was different from having to commute, an hour from DC to a team that never quite felt like your own, given the geographic distance involved. Um, but the other big thing, much bigger thing that happened when I lived in New York was of course 9/11, and I was working in finance at the time, and that was the catalyst that led me to actually quit that job a week after the attacks and join the military, where I served as an infantry officer for 5 years. In Iraq, or 1 year in Iraq, and then the other time was training here in America, and then being stationed in Germany. So that was kind of the first big career transition that I had. I came back to America. I went to grad school at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies here in DC. Went to work at the Pentagon for 4 years as a civilian in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and then that's when I had my next big career pivot, which was to leave that job to write what was my first book, um, The Prisoner in His Palace, which is about the 12 American guards who had been tasked with guarding Saddam in the days leading up to his execution, and kind of the very improbable, strange relationships that developed, um, in that these guards kind of found themselves growing to like him, despite the fact they were aware of the terrible things he was guilty of. They never witnessed that. They just saw this, older man that in some cases reminded them of their own grandfathers, who was charming and funny, um, and so when it came time to hand him over to be executed, they kind of had conflicted emotions about that. And so that was not based on my own experience. I was in Iraq actually at that time, but I was serving in Anbar province to the west, just as an infantry officer. So I wrote that book purely as a journalist. Um, so kind of fast forward in a bit, and hopefully that movie right now it has been optioned to become a feature film that would be directed by Johan Renck, who directed HBO's Chernobyl, which it won the Emmy Award, I think, a few years ago. So it's in good hands. They've signed some, very well respected actors to be part of it. So fingers crossed, in the next few years, maybe we'll see that on screen, hopefully. Um, so that book wrapped up. I did a number of long form magazine pieces after that book came out, and I had subsequently moved with my wife, and then she was pregnant when we moved, so we had our first son in Denver, where we actually lived basically like a 700-foot home run from home plate at Coors Field. So if you were to hit, over the left field fence and then out of the stadium and across the street, it would have hit our apartment building, which is about 700 feet away. You could see the field from our sort of rooftop patio. So it was a lot of fun. Got to get to a lot of Rockies games out there. Back when the Rockies are kind of a joke now, but there were a few years there where they snuck into the playoffs and they had kind of fun teams. Charlie Blackmon, Arenado, Trevor Story. They had some talent and some fun players. Um, so I was living out there when rumors, and this is what brings us to this book. Rumors of MLB contraction began to circulate. That was the fall of 2019. Um, and the rumors actually turned out to be very similar to what actually happened. But the rumors were going to be they were going to get rid of somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 teams. It was slated to happen after the summer of 2020. So there was going to be we thought there was going to be one final minor league season if this in fact happened. Of course, a few months later, January, February, March 2020 is when COVID emerged, and that ended up being the first season in the history of minor league baseball that was canceled in its entirety. And then, of course, as we all know, the MLB did go ahead and get rid of the teams. And so these communities really never even had a chance to, say goodbye to the teams that had been there in some cases, close to 100 years. I think COVID actually helped MLB pull this off, with less resistance than they would have otherwise faced. And they actually had been before COVID, that there had been kind of a bipartisan resistance. Bernie Sanders on the left was pushing it, and then there were lots of Republican delegations as well, because minor league baseball was important to communities across America, in red states and blue states and everywhere in the middle. And so there was resistance, but then COVID happened, which naturally overshadowed most people's attention. And to the extent people were paying attention, they were mostly focused on what MLB was going to do in the form of, would they play? It ended up being an abbreviated season, a lot of times in empty stadiums and stuff. But that kind of took up most of the attention. And so these teams, were cut, and it really kind of happened like under cover of darkness. My initial idea for a book, which my publisher wanted me to pursue, was going to be to tell the final story of the Appalachian League, which was one of the leagues that was scheduled to be eliminated. And I was going to go spend the year down there, probably like in the sort of the Pulaski area, and then also maybe near Johnson City. I mean, the one good thing about that league was everything was geographically very condensed and nearby. Of course, as we know, that season never happened, and so the book never happened. Luckily, I was able to salvage the research that I had been doing, and there were some of the reporting I had done down there in the form of a Harper's Magazine article on the end of the Appalachian League and what those teams had meant historically to those communities and what was being lost, even though I wasn't able to actually go to the games that summer. So how did this book originate? A gentleman who lives in Batavia, New York, named Bill Kaufman, who's a prominent character in the book, contacted me just out of the blue. He reached out to me through my website. He said he had read the Harper's article. He loved it. It everything I talked about those minor league communities reminded him of Batavia and the Muck Dogs and the fans that he knew up there. He had been a lifelong Muck Dog season ticket holder, as had been his parents. And he said, why don't you come on up here? I had subsequently moved to Pittsburgh. He said, why don't you come on up here? It's about a 4-hour drive. I'd love to just buy you a beer. We'll talk baseball, and I'll introduce you to some of the other fans. So I went up there that winter. This would have been the winter of, I think, after this 2021 summer. And I did talk to him. He introduced me to a bunch of other really colorful, passionate Muck Dog fans, and they had stood up this collegiate wood bat team to fill the hole that had been left by the extinction of the minor league team. And so it occurred to me, what, maybe the story is not just the death of baseball in Batavia, but the rebirth of baseball, through this entrepreneurial owner that had worked hard to stand up this new team that had actually been very popular in its inaugural season. And to communicate how important these teams are to these communities through these people that Bill had introduced me to, and other people I expected to get to know in the bleachers. And so my editor liked that book, or liked that idea, and that was really the beginning of this project, in which I spent the next year essentially commuting back and forth from Pittsburgh to Batavia, getting to know everyone. Before the season even started, I wanted to kind of hit the ground running, and then throughout that entire summer of baseball, and then into the following years, I kept up with everyone, because I just had this intuitive sense that it I guess that the communities that had lost teams, the 40 communities that had been eliminated, that this just wasn't generally going to be a good thing. I had been doing a lot of reporting in small towns across the country like these that had teams historically, and I just and I knew enough about baseball to connect the dots, to conclude that we really risk losing something special if we don't pay attention. And so that's really what drove me up there. This idea that these were civic assets that we should be preserving, and certainly not getting rid of. We can dig deeper later in the discussion if you want on why MLB did this, and the sort of the pros and cons of the various arguments that have been put forth. I think some of them are more convincing than others. I mean, one of them certainly money. It cost about 700,000 for the major league parent to float or to support one of their single A affiliates for a season. In putting that in context, that's what a Lindor or an Ohtani will make in like 3 games. So the money is there. It's just a question of where they're choosing to spend it, and clearly this was not where they wanted to spend it. There are some other explanations, that they also offered for why this happens, that I think are a little bit more convincing. Ultimately, I still don't think it was a good idea, but at least the arguments were a little more solid. The It was tough. Just logistically, it was a tough project because I had a wife at the time. My son was like 5, and she had given birth to our daughter, who, when I launched this regular commute, was about 2 months old. She hadn't even been born when this project, when we first sort of envisioned what it might look like. So it meant having to say goodbye to them, and be gone for a week or so at a time. I try to get back every week or two just to check in. So I did like a lot of short trips as opposed to like one long trip. But there's really no great answers. It's a question of sort of personal preference. And I guess just a few of the themes, and then I'll open it up to your questions. But a few of the things I tried to capture in the book, and that maybe are more familiar to this audience than other audiences, is just how these minor league games, especially at the lower levels, because I think AAA is different, obviously, from single A, and AAA probably more closely resembles MLB. But what you're going to find in the lower levels of the minors is that the atmosphere is really more of like a community picnic or a family reunion than what you're going to experience at a Yankee Stadium or even at Camden Yards. And that's, some of the reasons for that are very obvious. It's $99 for a season ticket. And so as a result, people go a lot. This stadium, and a lot of stadiums like it in these communities, it's right in the neighborhood. So you can walk out your front door and be in your bleacher seat 3 minutes later. And also, as a result of that, you find, I think, and this is one of the bigger things that struck me, was just this intergenerational element to the crowd, where you have 80-year-old grandparents, their children, their children's children, coming together sometimes, multiple times a week at the game. It's hard for an 80-year-old person to just physically get to like a Citi Field or a PNC Park in Pittsburgh, and you have to park far away. You have to get through security. You have to go up multiple levels. You have to, if you're in the upper deck, that's not easy to even get to in the first place. Whereas here, it was simple, and as a result, you had this nice mix of different generations coming together and having a good time. What also struck me, all of this was obviously taking place with the backdrop of political campaigns, and this, I think, sense, at least I had, that the country was kind of at each other's throats politically. And I never asked anyone who they voted for. That wasn't my concern. I wanted to get to know them as people. But I could connect the dots, and over the course of a year, I got to know them well enough to kind of deduce more than likely who they, what political party they were with. And it was just nice to see these people who on the surface would be kind of part of these warring factions, putting that aside and coming together in the ballpark and becoming friends. There were two nice older ladies. I shouldn't say that. If they listen, they're going to get upset. But, two nice women from Buffalo, who would commute 45 minutes each way, um, to Dwyer Stadium to go. They were season ticket holders. And the funny thing was they weren't even sports fans. They're probably the only two people in Buffalo that don't watch Bills games, but they just loved the atmosphere at the ballpark. And they were, most likely, I think, would identify as Democrats. And then the security guard at the ballpark was also a wonderful guy, kind of looked like he was right out of, MAGA Central Casting. But they became great friends over the course of the summer. They'd hug each other. He would hug them when they arrived, and they'd ask each other about each other's families. And it was just kind of this warm, human connection that the ballpark helped to foster. Um, and then I guess the last two things that I'll leave you with for now would be, um, there's no disputing the fact that the quality of the baseball was degraded. It's not as good anymore. Despite I think the entertainment product is still good. That Robbie and Nelly, the owners, really do, work 20 hours a day to put out something that's entertaining every night as best they can. But it's to have a drafted professional out there versus a Division III or mid-tier Division I player. It's just not the same. They'd be lucky to have one pitcher, breaking 90, or a few guys that could hit a home, clear the fence with a home run, as opposed to minor league baseball where those things are routine. And then I think more almost more importantly, you lose this sort of magical connection that had been around between these communities and and major league cities historically. So thinking back to the Appalachian League example, you go to Bluefield, West Virginia, and people there will talk about watching, Noah Syndergaard pitch against Jacob deGrom, in this tiny town in the middle of nowhere. And there's these two top, draft picks throwing 100 miles an hour, and that's just not there anymore. And more importantly, a place like Pulaski would have, community pride in the fact that, it's the small town in Western Virginia, but there's a direct connection to Yankee Stadium, and they're wearing the same pinstripes and they have the same name, and they will see a few of those guys play there someday. And so that magical connection is lost. And so even, if you have an independent league team or a collegiate team, that's certainly better than nothing. But it's not the same. And so that's, I guess, the last thing. There were any number of sort of rabbit holes I could have gone down, examining the business of baseball or the evolution of talent development, or, who knows what. But I couldn't. I would try to put enough in the book to provide that context there that was relevant, but I couldn't take like a 40-page detour, or I'd risk losing the sort of the narrative momentum of the story, and I'd lose any reader who wasn't just like a hardcore baseball fan. And of course, I wanted to appeal to not just baseball fans, but to a wider demographic. So I had to kind of pick and choose which of those sort of baseball specific issues I would examine, and how much time I would spend doing that. But I certainly was well versed in it, and I had to do a lot of research on it. So I'm happy to answer any questions, that may touch on some of those things. Um, so that's Oh, and then the last thing I guess that would be worth maybe mentioning would be, the fact that private equity has now been buying up the surviving teams, because that's something that's going to impact, I think, baseball moving forward. And so, you go from 160 to 120, and I wouldn't be shocked if they go down to 90, after this current agreement between the minor leagues and the major league parent expires. Um, but of those surviving 120, this one private equity firm, Diamond Baseball, now owns over 40. And in the course of researching the book, that number went from like 11 to 7, 16 to 21 to 24 to 31 to, each time I'd look, I'd have to edit the book and change the number because it kept getting bigger. And so what's that going to do? Right now, to their credit, they have not made any dramatic changes. They've tried to keep local management in place. I think as long as things go well, hopefully that will continue. I think my concern would be that, if they do decide they need to make cuts, it's going to be a lot easier to do that, from when the people you're cutting are just numbers on an Excel sheet, as opposed to people you work in the concession stand with, like was the case with the owners that I was writing about, and you work alongside the people that you potentially would have to get rid of. And then I think also that's kind of the worst case scenario. The more likely scenario, less bad, but also not great, would be kind of what one sports business person said was the Home Depotization of minor league baseball, where it just becomes more corporate. Like you start to lose some of the local sort of idiosyncrasies and eccentricities that made it special, and it all starts to kind of look the same because it's owned by the same people who start to try to do the same things. They see something making money in one place and they try to do it somewhere else where it just doesn't fit, and it just kind of loses some of the local specialness that had existed, when in many cases it had been owned by local people. um so that's it. Oh, and then the last, I guess, I'm sorry, the very last thing I would mention uh was, just this question of, well, what is baseball? Because I think you could argue, MLB would certainly argue, listen, it's a business, it's not a charity. We can do what we want, and we choose where to spend our money, and that's true. I mean, they're not doing anything illegal. Um, but what bothered me more was just kind of what I felt was a little bit of hypocrisy, where they would, wrap themselves in the mantle of sort of this Norman Rockwell Americana, Field of Dreams kind of imagery, to the extent where they have a Field of Dreams game in Iowa, and uh, which was, a commercial success. It was a ratings hit. Um, but if you dig into the details, the game itself was, the tickets were, a lot of the people that there were people that flew in from places like New York and Los Angeles, to have a fun weekend in the heartland. The tickets on the secondary market were more expensive than most locals could actually afford. They earmarked some for people that live nearby, but a lot of them, were not. And then meanwhile, just down the road, they cut two Iowa affiliates, where, the people actually could afford to go and could go throughout the entire summer. So that just, to me, that kind of personified a little bit of this what I felt was hypocrisy, where it's like, you're going to try to celebrate the grassroots of the game, but at the same time you're doing that, you're kind of cutting those roots, right down the road. So anyway, that I touched on a lot of things, and yeah, with that, I'm happy to answer questions that you might have.
Small group, guys, so feel free to fire away. Dixie?
Hello, I'm speaking to you from a mile from Fenway Park.
Ah.
So I am surrounded not only by them, but I'm surrounded by minor league baseball that used to be like Lowell and right in its
Mm,
current in New Hampshire. And
mm,
the Woo Sox that moved to Worcester from Rhode Island. But my first question is about writing itself.
mm.
What was the first piece that you had published and how did you get to that point?
That's a good one. I had an op-ed published in the New York Times, actually, after I got back from Iraq. And that was just, I'd been an English major, and I'd like to think I was a decent enough writer. And so that was just kind of luck. I sent it into the generic address, and they ran it. Since then I've tried probably 20 times to get in the New York Times, and I never have. So it was kind of a lucky shot there at the beginning. I actually had another one. I did a brief internship at the New York Times when I came back and got out of the military while I was waiting to go to grad school. And that was kind of cool because it was just kind of an apprenticeship. I spent a lot of my time just filling coffee and making copies for the more experienced reporters, but I also got to do some of my own writing and reporting. And one piece that I got published that I really enjoyed, that you can Google it. I'm sure you could find it on their website if you look at my name. But it was about being a Mets fan in Iraq, and it was just a little essay about waking up in the middle of the night because it was 6 hours ahead there. With a car at the time it was 2006, so it was, I think, the Mets Cardinals LCS. which was, you might remember, like went down to game seven. It was really dramatic. The Mets had a dominant regular season, but the Cardinals ended up winning in game seven. Carlos Beltran struck out. I think the bases were loaded to end their season. My buddy and I would get up in the middle of the night and just watch these games, and they would end like right before sunrise. And then we'd have to go back out on patrol and do our normal, work in Iraq. So it was kind of, for me at least, it was this brief little enjoyment in what was otherwise a pretty tough year. Oh, wow. But it didn't end well. So it was a lot of fun up until game seven, and then it kind of then it was depressing, and then you wonder, why did I stay up in the first place? Because now I got no sleep, and I'm depressed. So when they won, it was fun. When they lost, it was, you feel kind of like an emotional hangover at the end of it. I see Bob, it says here, says he was at that game. And yeah, that's a game I will never forget. So that was an essay I wrote that I thought was a lot of fun.
So did those particular pieces that you got in, was that when it suddenly rang to you, hey, I can do this?
Yeah, I think so, because and that predated my time at the Pentagon. So I did that New York Times internship. I had been published by then a few times, and I loved it. But as if my memory is correct, I mean, this was 15 years ago, but um, essentially, I think the New York Times came to me and they said, we like your work. Um, but you have no experience really to speak of as a journalist, aside from these few months you've been, here helping us out. We can send you to kind of one of our smaller, almost like the minor leagues of journalism. You can go to a smaller affiliate that we own, and then if you do a good job, we'll bring you back. But at that point, I was already in my early 30s. I hadn't just gotten out of college. I'd been working in finance, and I joined the military, and I thought to myself, that's just a big risk. What if I go somewhere for 5 years and they don't pull me up, and that now I'm going to be pushing 40 and having to start over again. So I ended up going to grad school and kind of taking the safer route, to employment, which was the working for OSD for the at DoD. But yes, I think that's what planted that seed, or planted that in my head, and that's why after 4 years at DoD I did take that big leap, and work on that first book.
Hey, Will, I'm Tony. I don't know if all those interesting topics you discussed there, thank you. I haven't had a chance to read your book. Are the topics you went through, are those all themes that you touch on in your book, or some of that new things you're thinking about?
No, those are all things so what I do is I tell the story of this one season of the Muck Dogs, focused primarily on their fans, and what these games mean to them. But in the course of doing that, I have to explain, well, why are we here in the first place? What were the forces that led to contraction? And then, and so I kind of use that season as a way to then weave in some of these other issues that I mentioned. I mean, I guess while we're there, the other real, I think, driving force behind contraction was just the idea. I mean, it's all about analytics now, and the idea that, we don't need 160 teams with thousands of players and hundreds of coaches and scouts, spread all across the country to more effectively determine, who the future major leaguers are going to be. It's much more efficient and cheaper. We'll send them down to our spring training complex, run them through a combine, using different, technological, forms of evaluation, put those into a computer, and that'll, tell us all we really need to know. Um, I mean, that argument does make a little more sense than saving $700,000, which just really doesn't seem to make really any sense at all. Um, but even that argument, if you talk to baseball people, there's plenty of people that will push back against that one too, and they will argue that there's a value in having an actual season and watching players play in real games against each other, and then more importantly, the what that argument, it's very narrow. It just sees minor league. It gets down to like, what do you see? What is the point of minor league baseball? And that argument, and I think the argument most MLB owners and general managers would say, is the only point is just to get the next, Bryce Harper to the majors, or Jackson Holiday, or whoever, whatever. What they're neglecting to take into consideration is, intangible things like the fact that a 30th round pick, yes, he's not going to make the majors most likely, but those are the guys that go back and become, American Legion coaches or high school coaches or Little League coaches. They're the ones who help there to be another generation of players, by spreading baseball back to these communities. There's also the geographic element to it. Yes, baseball is going to be thriving in Los Angeles and New York and Chicago. But, if you start just cutting access to professional baseball through enormous swaths of America geographically, um, recognizing that seeing players in person is one of the most valuable ways to grow a new generation. It's not the same just if it's only on TV. So they're doing some damage there too. I think it comes down to a degree of short-sightedness. We're going to save a little money now, but I think the expense of like the long-term health of the sport, as well as just I don't want to say mistaken, but just a different view of what the minor leagues are for in the first place, and not taking some of those other things into consideration. And then the last part, there's sort of unintended consequences as well. And I touch on this very briefly in the book, but the number of American-born black players is something that has been that Major League Baseball has been worried about, and the percent has gone down to, I think it's like almost as low as it was when Jackie Robinson first broke the color barrier. I mean, it's going in the wrong direction. And if you cut the draft from 40 to 20 rounds, the what are people going to do? The organizations are more than likely going to draft the most sort of well-polished, known product they can find, which typically comes from, expensive travel clubs and college baseball, which is predominantly white. And their willingness to go out on a limb and choose someone, without that pedigree is going to be lessened, just because you can't get anything, you don't have as much room for error. And so this decision, I think, will also certainly not help in their efforts to, try to diversify. So there's a lot of things that may not have gotten a lot of attention on the surface, but if you start digging, it it starts to become, I think, more clear that, this isn't a great direction for them to be going in.
A baseball question.
Hmm.
Since the second book is much different than the first book,
Hmm.
as you were taking on the second book and going chapter by chapter or however it's done,
Hmm.
what did you run into that you might have thought was suddenly much harder than you thought or much more complicated than you thought when you started it?
Mm. Um, well, one hard part was what I already alluded to, which was there was so much room to dig deeper into some of these topics than I felt I could do without, again, losing the thread and losing the reader. So any number of these things, like you could write certainly a whole chapter on, if not a whole book on, but I just had such limited space because I couldn't start introducing the characters of the book and then do 30 pages on, the MLB, the economics of Major League Baseball and why they're doing this, or 30 pages on, the how scouting is changing, or any number. So I would put it in there, but I just had to be really strategic about how I did it. That was probably the biggest challenge, was kind of connecting the Batavia story with like the bigger story. Yeah, that I would say that was the hardest part. And the other thing, I mean, this was an area too. I touch on this a tiny bit in the book, and this was another kind of area you could do a long detour on. But and this is very probably, germane to your group, which is kind of just analytics in general. And this, I certainly am kind of a Luddite, as far as technology. And two of the guys I write about in the book didn't even own. Not only did they not own an iPhone, they didn't even have cell phones. And not coincidentally, they were like the two happiest people I've met in years.
I could see that.
Um, but that's kind of, where I come out. I'm an addict, but I recognize it, and I wish I was more like those guys. Um, and I've been on different podcasts, where people will explain how analytics is critical and how analytics can tell really interesting stories as well, and that there is, room for that, and I agree with that, and I certainly agree with general managers doing whatever they can do to try to win. Um, but I guess my concern is, I think back to my great uncle who was a Brooklyn Dodger fan, and he talks, about Red Barber and, like a lot of kids, sneaking, the transistor radio into his bedroom and listening to the games. And I mean, even through Vin Scully and even like Bob Costas, the John Miller from the Oriole announcer. I mean, there were these wonderful announcers who could really bring the game to life, in sort of poetic detail. And when I turn on games now, a lot of the time, not all the time, but a lot of the time, it just sounds like a computer, simulation with just launch angle, spin rate, exit velocity, number after number after number. And it almost feels like a crutch, because announcers can just spit out those numbers as opposed to having to like do research and homework and get to know the players as human beings and tell those human stories, which make the sport more interesting. And so I just think, again, it's not, I don't think it has to be one or the other, but I feel like the pendulum is swinging really fast in that direction, at the expense of some of what, at least made the game special for me.
Or they could talk about the game that's going on right in front of them, and
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
would be
Yeah.
helpful to us listening to it on the radio or watching it.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's just, and it's even to the point now where there's, it's not just the numbers, but they will have actual simulations, graphically reproducing what you just saw happen in real life. And it's like, I don't know, some of us go to the ballpark to escape that part of our lives, not just to get more computers and more numbers. So yeah, again, I don't think it has to be either or, but I would like to see a little bit of a return to kind of the Vince Scully, era of announcing and like, and the write-ins, the same goes to the extent there is any print media left, it's kind of going in that direction as well.
Anybody
Anything
else?
else?
Yeah, very interesting talk. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you guys. Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and I don't want to sound like, too much of a Debbie Downer. I mean, the book does have a lot of positivity in it too, because I do, I think, communicate what it was that draws people to the ballpark. And that was an important, objective of mine in writing it, because, obviously if that's not there, then, then the story loses all its power. So, I kind of focused here on some of the things that concern me, but in the book, I think I also spent a lot of time communicating, what is still to love, and how these people in Batavia are, keeping that alive.
Well, between Wrigley and down the street here, Fenway, PNC is my favorite park.
Yeah, well, I agree. That would be my list too. Wrigley and Fenway, for obvious reasons, and then of the contemporary ones, PNC, Camden Yards. I haven't had a chance to go to San Francisco yet. I've
It's
heard
it's
that.
it's up there.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, and PNC is amazing. My only problem with PNC is every time you go there, you're watching the Pirates, and the owner won't, spend to have it's essentially a AAA lineup with Paul Skeens there for
Yes.
the next few years until he leaves. So
I was gonna ask you if they are ever gonna get another player besides O'Neill Cruz to bat in any runs for
yeah,
Skeen.
yeah. No, I mean, I talk about that in the book a little bit, the competitive imbalance. That's another example, like another one of these rabbit holes I could have gone down for, a long, and Coors Field, actually, where I used to live. That's a fun one too. I don't think it's quite at the level of Camden Yards or PNC, but it's definitely a nice one.
Yeah.
It was in 2018, I believe, that the SABR convention was in PNC, was in Pittsburgh,
Mm.
Yep.
and it was a tremendous week. I stayed 3 extra days after the convention was over so I could see the city, which I
Mm.
had seen before, but I wanted to see it now. And I went to games every day. It was 90 degrees every day. Sun was out every day. And I would sit at the ballpark and I would just sit there and be so happy watching the sun set on the
Yeah.
city
Mhm.
and just be comfortable and nice and warm and watch a ball. It was great.
And that area around the ballpark has improved quite a bit too. So there's even more now restaurants and bars and things, surrounding the ballpark. So that's definitely a huge success story.
And one big thing that I managed to do because I was there for so long is I made my way up to Forbes Field and
Uh,
actually went up the top of the Cathedral of Learning,
uh-huh.
which I had not done before. And
Nice.
when the day that I got there and I was talking to some lady there and she said, well, you could go up. And I said, what do you mean go up? She said, you can just go up to the top. And I said, you mean just a regular person like me can go up there? And she said, yeah, you can. I managed to get my way to as high as you could go and got some great pictures of the layout down there.
Yeah, and apparently you could see, I was just at an event at the Carnegie Library across the street there recently, and they said that, back in the day you could see, look into Coors Field from the higher levels of, or not Coors, into Forbes Field from the higher levels of that building.
Yeah.
I also recommend, if you guys haven't been, to the Clemente Museum.
Oh yes. Well, the SABR people went there, so it was great.
Oh, it's wonderful.
And that day, not only did I see the Clementi Museum in the morning, I went to the Andy Warhol Museum in the afternoon.
All the sites. Well, I will tell you, I'm not on the SABR National Board, even though I ran and lost. But they are looking to possibly do another one at Pittsburgh in the next couple of years, just because
Oh,
it was
wow.
such a success. And the smaller market areas, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, are a lot cheaper and easier on the wallets for SABR members.
Hmm.
So.
Yeah. That's one of the best parts about living in Pittsburgh is it's affordable.
And then plus that one would be drivable. Some of the other ones, they're a little more difficult to drive.
Yeah. So, like Texas this year is far, which is one of the reasons why I'm not going. So appreciate it. Hey, well,
Yeah.
quick question.
Hmm.
The New York Penn League obviously ceased to exist.
Hmm.
Aside from Aberdeen and the Brooklyn Cyclones, did anybody else survive?
Hudson Valley.
Oh, the Renegades. You're right.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, I think that's it. Yeah,
That's
and
it.
then the rest, went in a number of different directions. Like Tri-City, the Valley Cats, went independent. They're the ones that did the lawsuit against MLB that was settled. Most of them, a lot of them ended up in this collegiate league. Burlington's in Vermont's the Lake Monsters are in a different. Yeah, so they kind of all migrated in different directions. But to my knowledge, you hit on the ones that did survive.
Yeah.
I
I
think
remember when I met my wife, even though she's from Pennsylvania like me, she was living in Lowell. So she lived right across the street from the Spinners Park.
Mm.
Yeah, I think they're the only one that don't have a team. I don't think they have a team.
I don't think they have a team, and I'm not. If that park's used for anything, I'm guessing it's just probably for local or like college type stuff.
Yes, it
Yeah,
is.
the college team plays there, yes. But I don't think anybody else does.
Okay. So, but that was a nice park. It was right on the river. But
Mhm.
yeah, and from what we understand, those of us here in Maryland, Aberdeen might not have a team much longer either. So, still,
Mm.
I'm thinking maybe that them and Frederick will trade teams.
yes, that's the likely scenario because most people don't know the Ripkins sold the Ironbirds.
Yeah.
In the last
Someone
week.
just told, I didn't know that either until someone just told me recently.
Yeah, so I think they have a small share, but it's owned by a corporate group who also owns the Bowie, Chesapeake Bay Sox, and a few other teams.
Ah, I see.
I'm actually going to Aberdeen on Friday.
So I got to get up there this year just in case they don't exist after this season. So, well, good. Thank you, Will.
Yeah.
This is great. I'd love to. I'm gonna probably get some. Once I finish the Earl Weaver book, this might be something to move on to this summer. So
Yeah, well, Earl, I'm friends with the guy that wrote that one. He was on the same panel with me at the library this past weekend, so that I can vouch for the fact that's a good one. And yeah, hopefully you can pick mine up and please do help spread the word. Obviously, MLB's not going to help me spread the word because it's
well, yeah, it goes against their
critical of
brand.
them. So I need people like you to help spread the word.
And for you guys who are obviously in the Baltimore area, John Miller, not the announcer but the author, who wrote the Earl Weaver book. He'll be at the Babe Ruth birthplace the Saturday of Father's Day weekend.
I'll be there for that.
So I'm planning on being there for that.
Now, there was another John Miller with an H that pitched for the Orioles in the 60s also.
Before my time, but I do remember the name.
Well, I'll tell John that he has an eager audience in store for him here in a few weeks.
I think that might be one of our biggest crowds.
Yeah, so we're promoting it, and he's actually has an outside instead of bringing his own books, a local bookshop that's right over the city line in Baltimore County. He's gonna bring down the
I think we
actual.
might do that one outside.
Yeah, that's gonna be under the back under the tarp. So
Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you for having me. And like I said, help spread the word, and I appreciate the time.
all right, well, next time you're in Baltimore, give me a holler, and we'll get together.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I try to get there at least once a year if I can. This year's been wild with the book and with work, but I do try to get there as
Your
much as I
Mets
can.
are here next month, but the Pirates are here mid-September, I think.
Well, I'm definitely not going to travel to see the Pirates. I'd rather not see the Pirates even in Pittsburgh, but I do like to see the Mets, and I'm looking forward to seeing the Mets when they come to Pittsburgh, which I think is in a few weeks here, actually.
Yeah, I married a Philly girl, so I got to deal with that as well. So
Oh boy, yeah, they're in town this weekend. I may end up going to see them. We'll see. That's always and they try. Everyone travels to PNC, so no matter who's playing there, there's usually a lot of opposing fans because
opposing
like
teams,
it's a
yep.
great stadium and it's easily accessible for most of the Northeast. So there's always a lot of Mets, a lot of Phillies, a lot. When the Red Sox come once in a while, but it's still a good time.
Excellent.
All right.
All
Well,
right, guys,
thank
well,
you.
enjoy the rest of your week. It's going to be most of your East Coast. It's going to be hot for the next several days. So,
All right. Thank you all.
knuckle down. All
All
right.
right. Bye bye.
Have a good week.
Yep,
Thanks, guys.
bye.